As always, these seminar series are brought to you by the CSAC Support Hub for Criminal Justice Programming. It's under the CSAC umbrella, and our entire foundation of help for counties. And the Support Hub is what we call the strategic framework. This umbrella that you have been working through on both seminar series is really designed to cover everything from initial build, implementing and improving evidence-based and data-driven programming operations from beginning to end. Our grant funding right now focuses on capacity building at the local counties, led by technical assistance with the experts you see on the Zoom with you today, Mia, Mike, and Kevin, and that have been working with you throughout. And then really overall, again, we've discussed it over and over, but really the framework is just really intended to set your county up to both defend the work that it's doing by building and designing programming that is really meaningful and making impacts and moving California forward in a positive way. And then also recognizing what may be innovative or theory-based and still trying to help set a plan of action to how to measure that, how to achieve ultimately what you're trying to do and show that you can prove it. And that's really done at the end of the day, hint, hint, through rigorous evaluations, which is what we're going to be talking about today. And so all of these are really designed to build on each other. But we don't want to let that stop you. If you decide to jump in one place or another, that is absolutely okay. What it is continuing to build you toward that ultimate goal of kind of accomplishing positive programming and really following the evidence and data-driven decision-making around that. And then, in a world of operations and programming, I just go back always to really being able to show the hard work that you've been doing throughout this time and that you aim to do every single day. And how you can kind of strategize around that. And so all of these components really help you focus on how to control your narrative, what you're doing locally, and really where your plan is moving forward. Overall, today, we're going to continue our discussion on evaluations. The real last piece here, this is the culmination of all the operational work that you may have done over the previous years, or maybe just something you're jumping into right now to really assess where your program is at. This is going to be a pretty in-depth conversation, but we want to hear from you on your feelings throughout. So again, feel free to use that chat feature. Feel free to use that raise your hand feature. We want to know kind of what you're feeling as you're working through it. Do you feel disconnected from the process? Are there concerns about general evaluations that you have? I'm not sure to really how to embark upon them at all as we work through today. Again, we just want you to share those concerns, questions, and really kind of help us help you as we think about how we're going to be approaching evaluations in our technical assistance capacity. Okay, so I'm going to pass it over to Mia Berg, who's going to walk us through today's seminar, and we will be here to help as you need. Mia?
Thanks, Ryan. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us this morning. It's great to be here with you for our last seminar. Everyone who's here today has made it through, so give yourself a hand. We're really excited to talk about kind of the culmination of all the work we've been moving through over the last 9 months, which is into evaluation, really being able to understand what are the effects of the different interventions we're trying to use on the outcomes we're trying to change. And so I know that's what we're all here for, and it often feels like a long road to get there. And I really do think that's okay. I think we're moving in a direction where we're building the data strategy, that data infrastructure that we need to be able to monitor. And so we spent a lot of time doing that, the first 3 meetings together, just talking about how do you bring together the county data you need, the data from the state you need, and then integrate all those data sources so that you have that infrastructure to draw on to begin to move into building data dashboards and other kinds of visualizations so you really understand how your population is changing, what the characteristics are, what the outcomes are, what kinds of programs people are participating in, so that you really have a good understanding of what's happening in your space. And then today we're really capping that all off and saying, okay, well, how do you move to making more causal conclusions about what are? And so today we're going to walk through that. I wanted to take a moment, and Ryan, let me know if I'm having internet problems. I can switch to my hotspot. Let me know if there's any issues. I wanted to take a moment and just talk with you about kind of who the audience is for the seminar today. We're mostly going to be talking about methodology. So how do you go about conducting an evaluation? And then how do you apply the findings that you generate from those evaluations? And it can feel a little bit technical, but I think, the three audiences I have in mind are certainly my research colleagues that are working within agencies and departments who will conduct evaluations. So providing kind of a fairly deep overview of the methodological approaches you might choose, knowing that we can always follow up and, after the seminar over the next few months to talk about kind of how you actually apply those and how you select the methodology that is best for you. But really thinking about my research colleagues in the counties. And then managers who may not see themselves as researchers, but who are in the position of sort of overseeing and managing internal research. So wanting to really understand what it is that researchers are doing when they conduct evaluations so that you can effectively manage those evaluations as part of sort of the larger structure that you're managing. And then also thinking, and this is really important, I think, because often I've heard from folks that they've been frustrated by the kind of work gotten from external evaluators or any kind of external contracts. And so part of what we're doing here today is to give you, even if you're not trained as a researcher, to give you as a manager or in leadership position, really a little bit deeper insight into what your external evaluator should be doing so that you can better manage them and make sure that you get what you're looking for. You get something that really tells you what you need to know, and you feel confident that the approach was really rigorous and you can trust the results. Those are the three audiences we have in mind. So what I'm going to do today is actually to just start with the theory of change. And this is something we talk about in depth when we cover logic models in the programming seminar. And I know some of you are in that seminar and some of you aren't. So we're just going to take a few slides and walk through what is a theory of change and really how it's the structural basis, really the foundation for an evaluation. And then we're going to circle back to data strategy, and just remind ourselves how important data strategy is in determining the types of evaluation we can do and the quality of evaluation. And then we'll spend most of our time talking about how you design a program evaluation. So what are the different approaches and how you move through those methodologies to get to a result or a finding. And then we will lastly talk a little bit about policy evaluation, because we do focus a lot on programming at the county level, but there's also things that are done that are more like policies. So changes in policy that we also want to evaluate in order to direct decision making. So we'll spend a little bit of time on that. And after the program evaluation section, we'll stop for discussion, questions. We can spend as much time talking it as we want to there. So if you have challenges, if you're thinking about doing a program evaluation and you have questions or challenges, and you want to raise those for the group, that could be really productive, I think, for everyone to workshop a little bit. And then we'll also stop at the end after the policy evaluation for any general questions or final questions or conversation. So what is the theory of change? For those of you who weren't with us in the programming seminar or haven't encountered this language before, it's really the language we use to refer to how we understand a program or policy, how we understand how that policy or program is meant to or intended to affect outcomes. So what is the design theory there? And we often use something called the logic model, which we'll talk about in a moment, to diagram that theory, to really make it explicit. So it's really, a logic model is a tool to articulate that theory of change. And there are some key things we get from a logic model. We get to see, explicitly see those design components. We get to also see the key assumptions that are made. We always make assumptions in any theory of change, that one thing will affect another in a specific way. And so those assumptions become part of that diagram and really make it easy for us to see and for us to talk about. And then we should understand from a logic model what that relationship is between the core design of the intervention and the intended outcome that is the aim or goal of that intervention. And lastly, that logic model really helps us to diagram those key data points that we're going to want to make sure we include in our data infrastructure in order to get to a point of evaluation. So a typical logic model has 5 core components. There are variations on this. So, if you have a little bit of a different kind of logic model, that's absolutely okay. But the standard one that I work with has a component that focuses first on what are the resources or inputs that go into the program. So what do you have to work with in terms of resources? And then what activities comprise that program? What is it that you're doing with those resources to try to achieve planned outputs? So, what are the immediate outputs of that program? What do you see happening as a result of those activities? And then how do those outputs relate to those intended outcomes? And intended outcomes are really what we're hoping to change out there in the world, but typically in a shorter term framework. So thinking, what are we trying to change in the next couple years? Something we can measure and we can actually use to inform the success of the program. You might also have a vision for the impact of the program, and that might be a bit broader and a bit longer term and a bit harder to measure, but still part of your theory of change. So here's what a diagram might look like for a logic model. And you can see it's kind of a flow chart. And each of the squares, and when you fill these in, they get much bigger when you fill in all the resources, for example. But each of the squares represents those different components of the program. And everything you would put into those squares would be something that you would ideally be able to measure, at least in the first 4 squares. And the last one, impact, it can be a little bit harder to find data to measure impact depending on how long-term or systemic the impact you're trying to have is. But the idea is within those squares is where we add the components, and then we're able to then from there realize what those key data points are that we'd want to collect. And those first 2 components, those first 2 squares really represent sort of the plan for the program, whereas those last 3 squares represent what we're trying to achieve, what we want those outcomes to be. In particular, square 4 is where we usually focus outcomes evaluation. And the arrows, every arrow you see here represents a key assumption. And so in the first stage, the assumption is that if we invest these resources, we will be able to conduct these activities. And so at each stage, there may be a question about whether, in fact, that assumption was correct. You had the resources, say you got the budget allocation, but were you, in fact, able to conduct the activities? Did people show up for the program? Were you able to complete the program? Did something like COVID happen that got in the way of completing the program? So that's actually those arrows are kind of a question mark or a theory of what would happen that can actually be tested. And that biggest one in outcomes evaluation is really that arrow between outputs and outcomes. We have these immediate outputs from the program, but do they actually achieve the outcome that we're interested in achieving? And so that's the arrow that we're testing when we do an outcomes evaluation of a program. So to kind of distinguish between 2 types of evaluation that you hear about a lot, process evaluation is really focusing on whether the program was implemented as it was intended. So did we get the resources we thought we would? Were we able to use those resources to conduct the planned activities? Did things happen as we planned? And that's a really important question to ask, especially when you don't see the outcomes you might have expected. So process evaluations are always helpful in understanding, how is the program being implemented? Could we improve implementation? But they're crucially important if we get to a stage where it looks like the program isn't very effective and we're really stuck with the question of whether it was the implementation or it's actually the fundamental program design or the theory of change that we're not seeing produce the outcomes we hope for. And so today we're mostly going to focus on outcomes evaluation, and that can look at both whether the resources and activities produce those immediate outputs. So, in an employment program, did someone get a job right away might be an output, but more sustained economic stability might be more of an outcome, or maybe recidivism might be more of an outcome. And so we're focusing mostly today on methodology for assessing that last question. Did the outputs of the program actually lead to the intended outcomes? So I want to pause here for a moment and just highlight how important data strategy is. As you see in sort of the logic model with all the boxes, you can probably imagine if you're thinking about a program you'd like to evaluate, there are a lot of data points that are hard to get. And the more we can bring those data points into the infrastructure, the better position we are in to have what we need to do a rigorous evaluation. And so when we've been working on that data strategy throughout this seminar, we've really been thinking about, what are the key data elements to understand the population characteristics, to understand the program or the policy intervention, and to capture the outcomes we're interested in. How can we bring all that data together in one place to allow for integration so that we can bring it together to then apply it to evaluation? And then lastly, if we are lucky enough to have, change over time or over place, then how can we bring data together from multiple time periods or from multiple places to make that richer evaluation approach? So how fundamental data strategy is to evaluation is what we're just emphasizing here. So we're going to jump in and we're going to start talking about methodological design. And I wanted to start with, what is the most straightforward and often the first step in thinking about how do we know if a program worked? We think, okay, well, people came into a program and they had maybe a certain set of outcomes. Maybe they were just leaving jail and they were unemployed, and maybe they entered employment outcomes and their jail booking outcomes after the program. And that seems like a very straightforward, logical way to start to begin to assess whether the program was effective. Did it improve outcomes for the people who participated? And so one of the challenges to doing that, certainly a good starting place, but one of the challenges is that sometimes when people are coming into programs, they're often at a low point. And so we may see improvement for those individuals through their participation in the program, but we can't necessarily attribute it to the program. So it's hard to distinguish between how they might have improved anyway and how much they improved just because of that program. And so effectiveness analysis, and then to move to cost effectiveness analysis, we really want to precisely identify, what role did that program play in their outcomes improvement? And so that's why we often move to other kinds of methodological approaches. So one of the things we do is that we try to compare participants and non-participants. So we might look at everybody leaving jail, some people who participated in an employment program and some people who didn't, for example. So participants and non-participants. And we'll ask, did those participants have better outcomes than the non-participants? And of course, there are also challenges here. This entire presentation is about challenges and strategies and feeling that there's no really perfect way to do this, but that there are stronger designs that we can use. And so I'll just flag that for you right here. So when we come up with this approach, we think, okay, well, let's compare participants and non-participants over a similar time period, perhaps. One of the things that we worry about is selection. So, are the people that participated in the program, are they selected in some way? Are they different from the non-participants? And we might think they're positively selected, right? We could imagine that they are likely to have better outcomes than non-participants because they're more motivated, for example. And that might be something that's hard for us to observe. We might also think that they're negatively selected, right? A lot of people who are participating in programs might be higher need than non-participants. And so it's hard to sort out whether they're likely to be negatively selected or positively selected sometimes. Sometimes you can think that through. And if you're able to think that through, you actually better understand sort of the direction of the bias. So if I think that program participants are negatively selected, meaning that they're higher need, and I still find that they have better outcomes after participating in the program, that's actually fairly strong evidence, right? Because given that they're higher need, we might expect them to have lower outcomes than non-participants. But if they in fact have better outcomes, then I can feel a little bit more confident in that finding. But if I'm not sure if they're positively selected or negatively selected or maybe a mix, then it's harder to interpret that finding. I have to ask myself, well, did they have better outcomes because of their characteristics? Or did they have better outcomes because of the program? And so kind of trying to figure out how to sort that out. And so a lot of what we do in the methodology side of this is we use statistical methods to try to adjust for the differences in characteristics between participants and non-participants. And another way of saying that is we try to get to a place where we're really comparing apples to apples. So similar people, some of whom got a program and some of whom didn't, so that we can really isolate the effect of that program. And so we have a few ways of doing that. There's a lot that we're not covering today, but I think this is sort of the main and most important components of how you think through a methodological strategy. And really key here is, how do you address that selection that you're concerned about when you have people participating in programs? And so one way that we do that is we use an experimental strategy. And when we use an experimental strategy, we're going to talk this through in a minute. What we're doing is we're actually deciding who gets the program. So the individual themselves is not selecting in or selecting out, but we're deciding, we, the researchers, administrators of the program, are deciding who gets it. And so we control the selection, and that turns out to be very helpful because we can remove that piece and really focus in on the effect of the program. It's often not the case that we can preemptively plan an experimental strategy or that it's feasible to complete it. And so we're often actually in a space where we're using what we call observational strategies. And that just means that we're kind of looking back on what's happened. We have to deal with selection in a different way. People are going to self-select or be selected into programming, and then we have to deal with that on the back end using statistical methods. And so what we're going to do for this section is just walk through experimental strategies and observational strategies. I just want to take a pause and check in with Ryan. Have there been any questions that have come up, or does anyone have questions before we keep moving?
No questions thus far. I don't see any hands raised, but if anyone has a question or would like to raise your hand, please feel free to do so, and we will address it.
Okay, feel free to interrupt me, Ryan, as I go.
Yeah, no problem.
So for experimental strategies, the first thing that comes to mind probably for a lot of you is, randomized controlled trials, or RCTs. You hear about these a lot. The main idea here is that we are deciding among a group of individuals who are eligible for a program, we're deciding who will actually get that program and become part of a treatment group, and who will not get the program and become a control group. And we're randomizing that, meaning that in no way is it based on the characteristics of those individuals, aside from the fact that the whole group is eligible for the program. If the randomization is successful, we should see that the observable characteristics, so those things that we have data on that we can observe about people, maybe their demographics or their criminal history, we should see that those are similar in both the group that's treated or the participants in the program and the group in the control or the non-participants in the programs. They should have similar observed characteristics. And importantly, the theory is that not only will their observed characteristics be similar, but also the things we can observe, things like motivation, perhaps, would also be similar. And this is really what's special about randomized control trials or any kind of experimental strategy, that both the observed and the unobserved characteristics in the participant group and the non-participant group should be similar. That really allows us to say that any effects that we estimate of the program are due to the program and not due to the characteristics of the participants. So one of the issues of randomized control trials, we often hear that they're very expensive, and that if you're contracting with an evaluator to do an RCT, that's often quite true. And I just wanted to, before I jump into the slide, I just wanted to address this because we often think of them as very expensive, but in fact, they can be quite low cost if you're drawing on administrative data. So one of the biggest costs in randomized control trials is the data collection and bringing together all the data that we need. And if you've built that data infrastructure internally within your county and you have that ready to go, you can often conduct an RCT at a very low cost. We call these low cost RCTs, low cost administrative RCTs. And so putting kind of cost aside for a moment, there are other feasibility issues. There are often coordination challenges. So how do you actually randomize entrance into a program? How do you determine sort of a broad eligible group? And then how do you randomize who gets treatment and who doesn't? There are often issues that some people won't comply with treatment, even if they're randomized to have the treatment. And so you might get imperfect compliance. So I kind of refer to these as coordination or logistical challenges. So it's not as straightforward as us just deciding who should get treatment. And then there may be legal or ethical issues. We don't want to withhold treatment from any group that might benefit from it. And so there are challenges to using an RCT approach. They often work best when we either don't have capacity for everyone in the program, so there's going to be people who aren't able to participate in the program anyway, or we're in a situation where we really don't know if it's an effective program, so we're kind of piloting the program, we're just getting started, and so we wouldn't want to go full into supporting and resourcing the program until we understand better whether it's effective. So it may feel like RCTs are much more difficult to implement on the front end, but the benefit is on the back end, once you're then going to look at the effects of the program and want to estimate those effects, if randomization is successful, we simply compare the outcomes of participants and non-participants to determine the program effects. So typically we don't have to come in with a lot of sophisticated statistical methods to try to precisely estimate the program effects. We're able to just kind of compare the outcomes of people who got the program and people who didn't. I wanted to also mention some pseudo-experimental strategies. So you don't necessarily begin the program with an experiment, but sometimes there are conditions under which we feel like there is essentially randomization into the treatment. And one that's become very popular in the past decade is the regression discontinuity approach. And essentially what we're doing here is we're only working in a specific kind of situation where entry into a program is based on some kind of cutoff point. So for example, it might be that if you have a certain need score, if you're above that threshold, you're going to get entered into the program. And if you're below the threshold, you aren't. And the theory is that there's some randomization around that point. So, there's not, another way of saying that is there's not that much difference between somebody who scores right below and right above. And you can think through whether that theory applies, in the case of the program that you're talking about. But often with things like test scores, for example, there's really not that much difference between somebody who got an 88 and an 89. And so we might say, if that's the case, if that feels like that could be the case, that there's some randomization there. And so that those individuals, those just below and just above the cutoff, essentially have similar characteristics. And so by zeroing in on that small, narrow band of people, we can say, if one person did, if the group that got the program did better than the group that didn't, we can have a pretty strong conclusion that that program was effective, right? And so it's a way of sort of bringing in randomization after the fact, or not conducting it from an RTC approach, but still getting some of the benefits. There's also some concerns, however, if you're focused on just people around that cutoff point, you may have strong what we call internal validity, which we'll talk about in a moment. But there's some concerns if we want to think about, what was the effect for someone just above the cutoff point, say on a mental health scale, versus someone really far above that cutoff point or really low, really at the low end on that distribution. Would the effects be the same? And so can we generalize the effects for this group right around that cutoff point? Can we generalize them to the larger group? I wanted to take a moment to just emphasize you'll hear internal validity and external validity, and to just talk about them kind of in the context of program evaluation. When we think about internal validity, we're thinking, okay, how accurately is our evaluation estimates really picking up the true effects of the program for those people who participated in it? So are we doing a good job of really understanding and precisely estimating how this program affected outcomes for the participants in the program? And external validity is thinking about, well, how can we generalize from this evaluation? In what ways do we want to generalize? And are those generalizations valid? So if we want to sort of apply beyond the treatment group or beyond the study environment, and you all might think about this a lot when you look at the literature and maybe feel a little unsatisfied when you're meant to draw on a literature that was, that is based on studies that were done in other places and other time periods and for other populations. And so you're asking yourself, would we have the same effects of this program for our population in our county right now that this study found in this other context? And so you're really asking external validity questions. So I'm going to move into observational strategies. And that's sort of when we're often in this context, we're often not in that experimental context. And we have to kind of work with what we have. We're coming in after the fact and we're saying, we have a program available in this county. Some people participate in it, some people don't. We want to understand if it's effective. And so we don't have that experimental context. And so we have to find a way to make a valid comparison between participants and non-participants, and from there to kind of draw an estimate of the effect of the program. So I'm going to walk you through how I typically do that. And it's a framework that you can use if it's useful to you. And sort of the first stage is characteristics and differences. So thinking about, what are the characteristics of participants and non-participants? So getting all the relevant characteristics, all that data together to be able to look at what's relevant. And when you're asking yourself what's relevant, you're really asking, what are the characteristics of these participants and non-participants that might affect their outcomes? And if they're different for participants than non-participants, I might see a difference in outcome. So, having lots of characteristics is really important, but there is a way in which you can sort of narrow the characteristics to those that you think may affect outcomes. And so when I'm typically thinking about recidivism, that's commonly an outcome we're looking at among other outcomes. I think demographic to look at. And if they're different between participants and non-participants, I'm going to be a little concerned that those differences could be driving that experience sort of in the community and the likely recidivism outcomes. And so within this first stage, we're thinking, what are the key characteristics? And then we're assessing how do they differ? Do they differ between participants and non-participants? So just getting an understanding of, observationally, as things happened in the world, what did we get in terms of who participated and who didn't, and how they're different. And so then we think, okay, how can we develop a strategy so that we're comparing likes to likes or apples to apples? And so we're focused on the participants and their characteristics. We want to understand what was the effect of the program for that group of participants. And so what we want to do is try to narrow that group of non-participants to people who have similar characteristics to those who participated. And one really helpful strategy to do that is to use a matching technique. And so there are a couple different ways of doing this. You may have heard of P-score matching, or multivariate matching, or genetic matching, but it's a relatively new approach to find a way to draw, to narrow that non-participant group by drawing folks that are very similar in their characteristics to participants. So we're saying we're going to match non-participants to participants, and we're going to drop out people who are very dissimilar from participants from the analysis. And it's a way of sort of narrowing before you move on to regression. And regression techniques are really how we adjust for differences in characteristics, the observed characteristics for participants and non-participants. And so after doing a matching, you might find that you've perfectly matched and these two groups look exactly the same. And there's no sense in applying a regression analysis. You can just go ahead and compare outcomes in a way that's similar to what we would do for an RCT. But often we're not able to perfectly match. And so we add this additional layer of regression analysis, which is a model that helps us to really isolate the effects of the program from the effects of differences in characteristics of the participants and non-participants. And so by applying a regression analysis, you're going to come up with an estimate of the effect of the program that adjusts as best we can for any differences in characteristics. Now, you may see people use regression alone. That's absolutely fine. Skip the matching step. You might see people use matching alone and not feel the need to add the regression layer, but I've kind of outlined both here, and I try to use both in my work. So even when we take all those steps, and those are a lot of steps beyond just comparing outcomes of participants before and after, we still have some questions because we're only able to adjust for characteristics that are, and so there might be some differences in characteristics that are unobserved. And so we still have, it's a rigorous approach, but if we can do more and add rigor, we want to. And so I just wanted to mention some of the ways that we can really be advantaged in conducting evaluations if these conditions are present. And so if there is some variation in the program implementation, it may help us to better address individual self-selection and treatment. So here's some examples of how, program dynamics, the implementation dynamic might be helpful. So sometimes we have a program that's introduced at a certain point in time. And so we know that the people who were maybe moving through the probation department at an earlier period of time didn't have exposure to that program, but people who moved through at a later point in time did have exposure. And in that case, it's actually more advantageous for us to look at non-participants in that pre-period and compare them to participants in that post-period. Or even to do both. We might look at non-participants and participants in that post-period and compare their outcomes, but we might also take advantage of the fact that folks didn't have access to this program in the pre-period and compare them to participants in the post-period. And what that tells us is that there might be some folks that are even more similar in that pre-period that would have participated in the program had it been available. And so we can also take advantage of variation across place. So if a program was only available, say, in one jail and not available in another, or in one county or not another, programs that are available to certain participants. And we kind of have to be careful with this because the characteristics of the participants could affect the outcomes, but sometimes we can look sort of at a group that was eligible and that wasn't eligible and use that to construct a comparison. So we're always thinking, I want to get the best comparison possible so I can really program as really the key difference between these two groups of individuals' outcomes. So you're always thinking, what is a good strategy to do that? How can I best get there given the conditions that I'm working in? So when we have evaluation findings, we're always thinking, what did I find? Did I find the program to be effective? And if the program was found to be effective, do I trust the results? Are there reasons why I think, for example, people could be really positively selected and maybe I wasn't able to deal with that? But if I find it to be effective and I feel that my approach was rigorous, well, then what? Should we expand the program? Is it just right? Should we potentially expand it? Were there certain subgroups that did particularly well that might benefit most from an expansion? So kind of to whom do we expand it? And these are questions about sort of external validity. How can we generalize the effectiveness of this program for the treated population? Do we want to generalize it outside of that population and try to move the program forward in that way? Or maybe we just want to conclude that it's effective and continue to resource it and make it a core program. On the other hand, if we find that the program was not effective, then we have a lot of questions to ask ourselves. And really what we might say is we haven't found evidence of effectiveness. So it may be that the program is effective, but we haven't found evidence of effectiveness. It can sometimes be quite hard to prove effectiveness. And so the first thing we might want to think about is, was the program implemented as we intended it to be? And so we might want to go back and look at that process evaluation. You can always do a process evaluation in advance, but if you have limited resources, you might focus on doing process evaluations where you don't find evidence of effectiveness. And if you find it wasn't implemented as intended, then that might create the motivation to think about improving the implementation and then reevaluating. We might find the program wasn't effective overall, but it was in fact quite effective for certain subgroups. And so maybe the direction the evaluation pushes us in is into better targeting. And we might conclude that, this model just isn't working and the program needs to be replaced. So those are all sort of the different ways we want to be prepared prior to getting any results from the evaluation to kind of think about how it's going to impact decision-making. So I'm going to turn it to Ryan now for questions and discussion. I'm going to stop my share for just a moment so we can talk.
Thanks, Mia. I apologize in advance too. My internet is very spotty right now for some reason. So if you have any questions about what we've discussed thus far, or just have experiences with the process, concerns about approaching certain programs, concerns about what kinds of responses you'll get at the end of research, we'd like to hear from you. Share your opinions, your thoughts, anything. I don't see any hands raised, but feel free to just unmute yourself as well if you have anything you'd want to discuss or ask a question on. No, it is a lot to digest. And I go back when we first started building this presentation, Mia in particular, I went back to some of my operational days and was thinking through how helpful these things are to have the conversations with researchers to make sure that I'm highlighting things that I would have been concerned about by saying, hey, I don't just want some sentence at the end saying it works or doesn't work. I want to be able to describe what kind of subpopulations are impacted. Or I want to help make positive changes in the programming, or be able to look at it more broadly, not just get results, but how do I help actually improve programming? And so if any of these things are bubbling up, feel free to jot them down, throw them in the chat, or raise your hand and we'll, kind of address them as we go through. But definitely, I think a really important conversation to have, and really kind of know that this educational material exists out there to make sure you're informed on all the different aspects of how researchers can approach evaluations. Okay, I will put it back to Mia if you want to keep going.
So we're going to jump to policy evaluation, and I'd love to, as we're talking through policy evaluation, I'd love for you all to think about, is there something you want to evaluate? Because this is just an opportunity. I know that the slides are in the presentation and it's recorded and it maybe serves as a reference, but this is also a chance for us to kind of workshop and troubleshoot and give feedback on anything you're thinking about right now. So no pressure to join in when we come back together again for discussion, but just keep that in mind. We're very open and interested in kind of workshopping the challenges you're having or the ideas you have. So I wanted to also add just a level of policy evaluation, which is distinct from program evaluation in the sense that it's higher level change. It's often simpler. There's often not sort of an in-depth program design, but there is often kind of a theory of change. Why are we changing this policy? Well, sometimes because of resource constraints, but sometimes because we have an idea that it could actually improve outcomes. And so those are things that happen at the state level, as you well know, also at the county level, that we may want to evaluate. And so the nice thing about a change in policy is that we often have this pre-period and this post-period. So there's a very clear marker for when the policy changed or was implemented. That's not always the case, but it's often the case. And it really gives us a lot of leverage on the research design. So that variation over time creates opportunities to conduct what we call sort of a natural policy experiment. So a natural policy experiment really leverages that change over time in the exposure to the policy in a similar way to when we talked about if a program sort of was implemented at a certain time period and folks that were moving through the system before that time period were just not exposed to the program, so they had no option to participate. Similarly, with a policy change, people who are affected by the policy in the post period are really the treated group, but there are people we can compare them to that are moving through the system in the pre-period and that had no exposure to that policy. So it gives us a really nice design. And so, as always, we really need to think about, are the treated group in the post period, are their characteristics similar enough to those of the untreated group? We might also worry about sort of broader changes over time, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. But the theory is that, if it's a tight enough time period, you're looking at the year before and the year after the policy change, for example, which isn't always feasible, but that's a pretty tight time period. And so we're less concerned about broader changes over time versus sort of a 10-year period before and after. We might be concerned that a lot of other factors are changing over that period that could affect outcomes. So this isn't just an outline of what you saw before, comparing outcomes before and after a change in policy, similar to comparing non-participants in a program, but just sort of applied to the policy space. And so similarly, we're thinking about that pre-group as the control group, the pre-policy group, and the post-policy group as that treated group or treatment group from whom we're going to estimate the effects of the policy. Comparison, we want to think about, well, in fact, are their characteristics similar? Is it true that their characteristics are similar? And even if they're pretty similar, we would expect some variation. And so we want to kind of identify where there might be some differences, and then maybe use a matching strategy with a regression, one or the other, or layered on top of each other to adjust for any of those differences in characteristics. And that regression analysis, it will give us an estimate of the effect of the policy on outcomes for that group that was treated by the policy. So one example of this is some work that I've done on public safety realignment with my former colleagues, all of us now former PPIC folks, but back when we were at PPIC. And so I put a link to this study because it kind of gives you an example of this design. So you can kind of walk through the report and appendix. And if you wanted to use this sort of pre-post design where you use matching and then regression analysis to estimate the effect of a policy on outcomes, this gives you a model for doing that. And so just to give you a little context, what we're doing in this report is we're saying, okay, well, before realignment, folks in a certain group were kind of going to prison, and then they were released from prison onto parole. And then following realignment, there were a lot of different policy treatments. Some folks were still going to prison and being released, but onto PRCS. Some folks were actually being held at the county level as 1170Hs and not going to prison at all. And some of those individuals were getting probation after their jail term. And so we were able to think about those different policy treatments, those different groups that were treated by realignment, and then use the pre-realignment group as a comparison and sort of match those characteristics to the pre-realignment group, and then look at differences in outcomes. And we were really trying to address the question, did realignment increase recidivism, or did realignment reduce recidivism? And so we found a little bit of mixed effects, more increases in rearrest, but lower reconviction, generally speaking. And so we were able to kind of assess the effect of that policy change on recidivism outcomes in that way. One of the challenges, of course, that people will raise when you're doing a pre-post, any kind of pre-post analysis is, well, other factors that are changing over time that affect recidivism or any kind of outcome of interest: crime, recidivism, employment levels, education, mental health status, any of these outcomes. There could be changes in broader factors that are affecting those outcomes. And you want to really be able to separate the effects of the policy change from the effects of just broader changes over time. And so I wanted to just mention this methodology because you probably hear it come up now and again. And the methodology actually says, okay, well, let's create a cohort that was treated by the policy in the post period. And then let's find some similar individuals in the pre-period. And that's what we were just talking about a moment ago. So we have sort of this pre-post cohort. And that's great. We're going to estimate the effects of the policy using that cohort. But then we're going to add a second cohort, and it's kind of a control cohort. It's people that were in the pre-period and not affected by the policy, and in the post-period and not affected by the policy. And that control cohort gives us an understanding of kind of what was changing besides the policy, how outcomes were changing besides that policy change. It helps us to sort of difference out any broader changes over time that are captured kind of by that control cohort from the changes that we're seeing in the treated cohort. And so just to give you like a concrete example of this in a study, you can go look at the design and the technical appendix, and kind of it provides an outline of how this is done. When my colleagues and I looked at Prop 47 and the impacts of Prop 47, we wanted to understand, were there effects on crime? And so we looked at crime pre-post the implementation of Prop 47. So that's kind of looking at crime in California. That's our treatment cohort pre-post the implementation of Prop 47. But then we also wanted to be able to control for any broader changes in crime rates. And so what we did was we created a control cohort made up of kind of other states that, taken together and sort of weighted, made a fake California. But a fake California that didn't have Prop 47, right? Didn't have that intervention. And so we use that as the control cohort, and we're able to use a difference in differences analysis to difference out sort of broader national changes in crime rate from what was happening in California. So what do you do with policy evaluation? I think, for one, a lot happens at the state level that counties want to understand. You want to understand how those changes at the state level are affecting you, of course, and how you can advocate for sort of your best interest as counties to state level decision makers. And one thing that's very helpful to researchers in trying to understand how those statewide changes are affecting folks at the county level, and to be able to look at multiple counties as a methodological tool to be able to assess the effects of those state level policy changes. And so it's helpful to have state level finding, state level policy findings so that counties can best advocate for what serves their interests and sort of best prepare for future changes. But it's also helpful at the county level because there's so many policy decisions that you have to make for your county. And I think it helps sort of the county overall to better make informed decisions, but also informs the advocacy and adaptation that you need to do within your departments and agencies in order to respond to those changes and direct those changes. So I thought we might take a few minutes, and this absolutely does not have to be the topic that we talk about, but something that I've heard folks talking about quite a bit and kind of curious about is what were the effects of zero bail under COVID on maybe pretrial misconduct or on recidivism or on crime. This is something I've heard kind of come up in a lot of counties, just some concern about it, but also the desire to learn from it. And so I'm wondering and curious if these are questions that are coming up for you in your county, and maybe we could talk through kind of like how you might design a policy evaluation to look at some of those questions.
Mia, did you have any thoughts on maybe some of the first steps that can be taken?
Yeah, I think these are, it's a set of questions. And as folks mentioned, it's not just zero bail, there's a whole bunch of different changes that happened at once. And so that becomes such a tough space to do evaluation because, first of all, so many things are changing that could affect outcomes. So it's hard to isolate the effect of one change. And then second, you have such a different environment, right? Sort of everything's changed about the environment. And so one of the approaches, I think, is to really start at that data dashboard visualization stage so that you can diagram, what's happening in terms of population characteristics, how are they changing, how might that affect outcomes, what's happening in terms of policy change, and try to see those changes. So we had zero bail. Well, did a lot more people get released pretrial? Did that change happen? So that you can start, and so on, so that you can start to construct some theories based on what you're actually seeing in the descriptive outcomes, right? Do we see a lot more people being released pretrial? Do we see a decline in the jail population? Okay, well, that kind of sets the stage for a theory that asks, what would the effect of more people being released pretrial have on pretrial misconduct? So that's a fairly tight question we can start with. The idea that fewer people are in jail, how would that affect crime rates? So we can start to kind of narrow in on what are the key outcomes that we're interested in, and how can we narrow the scope of the analysis so that we're actually going to be able to estimate the effect for that change in policy, not sort of the bigger picture effects. That's really tricky to do in the COVID context. I don't know if Mike wants to speak to this because I tend to be a little more bright and shiny about the options, and Mike tends to be more practical and realistic. But Mike, did you want to say anything about some of the challenges of doing analysis in the COVID context?
Sure, and some of them are very practical challenges, like in some jail systems, the zero bail amount gets overwritten. So someone post bail and they're released from jail, and then it shows up as zero, that they no longer had a bail requirement. So that's one very practical issue that comes up, where you can't necessarily identify who receives zero bail. You know that there's a big change in people being released quickly, and in the data you see many more individuals that have a zero bail designation. However, it's not an accurate designation. So that's one issue that comes up. And clearly, as you said, Mia, when multiple things are changing, there are some techniques we can use, like you described earlier, using the difference in differences approach. That's one way to get at this, but it becomes difficult to analyze exactly what's happening. Was it zero bail that changed things? Was it that the criminal justice system had changed as a result of COVID and court processing? So those are some of the challenges. But regardless, there's still work that can be done there. There can be descriptive analysis that's done about how things change, how bookings have changed, how quickly individuals were released pre-trial, those sorts of things that describe the system. And then depending on your data systems and your ability to control for some of those differences that you had described, Mia, there is the opportunity to do a more rigorous outcome evaluation, but those are more challenging, and it certainly depends on the data that's available in the jurisdiction. So we have worked in a couple of jurisdictions to do this sort of work, and I'm hoping to work in an additional jurisdiction to dive into this in more detail. But yes, it's something that's of interest around the state.
We know it's an in-depth conversation. We know a lot of people, especially people like, my background coming from it, this kind of stuff is so foreign to begin with, but just having those definitions out there, having those discussion points to jot down and make sure that you are approaching these kind of conversations is so important. And then the only thing I was going to recommend off of this is sometimes it's helpful to sit with your team for, a half an hour, an hour, and start jotting down those policy changes. I'm sure all of you have done this at some point or another. Start jotting down those things that have changed over the last year. Start jotting down some of those problems that maybe Mike mentioned that are real practical problems about how to address it. The more that you're kind of collecting those conversation points, the more that we can both brainstorm with you and be helpful on how to kind of adjust or approach certain things, and the definitely better off you'll be as you start to have conversations with those trying to produce any kind of evaluations or outputs about what happened in the last year. You'll have a much better foundation to start approaching those conversations. Okay,
yes,
so
I would just say, we're going to go back to the slides for a few minutes, but I just want to say, I know it's hard to workshop in a large group like this, but if you do want to have some of these more discussions about the questions that are coming up in your county and how you might on them, that's a great thing to reach out to us about. It might just be an hour, meeting where we kind of talk through some of those issues with you, or it might be that you want us to help in a more substantive way, but that's what we're here for. So if, as we're going through this presentation, if things are coming up for you, please follow up with Ryan or any of us, and we can collaborate to move some evaluative work forward.
So just to kind of finish it up, any final Q&A, feel free to let us know along the way. And, it doesn't have to be here. It can be after as well. Just to talk about materials a little bit, we have the recording that will go up in a couple of days, probably by the end of this week, that will be on here. We will also have the PowerPoint that's up today that kind of walks through these in details. And then we have 2 materials available, which is a step-by-step guide to evaluation. This is a large document, but really takes it through the detail of kind of how to think about approaching evaluations. And the second material that's available on our website is the key items to get it right when conducting RCTs. And so really kind of focusing on, when you're thinking about randomized control trials, what are those kind of steps and what are those key points that you really need to be paying attention to? Again, really educational material, even if you decide not to embark at doing the evaluation yourself or in your local county and your agency, just understanding kind of the dynamics around it will help inform conversations as you move forward with evaluations. And then I wanted to, let's see what we have next. Looking ahead, we're done. We're done with the seminar series, and what we're going to be doing is circling back to really focus on technical assistance as we round out our current grant. And then also, we will be I plan on holding at least 2 more seminars in the upcoming months to really focus on things that are at the forefront of your issue. Really kind of create some ideas that maybe you're interested in hearing about. And so it can be everything from, how did the budget land, to upcoming legislation, to questions like this. Let's just take an hour and get on a Zoom and really brainstorm about how to approach questions that you're receiving. And so feel free to jot those down and let us know. Or in the alternative, if something comes up that you're just like, I don't even know how to approach this, but I'm getting this question a lot, shoot it over to me in an email, and we'll track through it and kind of keep it as a conversation point as we move forward thinking about topics that we need to be having more broadly. Really, the focus, again, is you guys are all here. You have been through this with us in this series, and I think we really have an opportunity to really create a community of collaboration. So as things are popping up in your counties, share those with everybody, and we're really helpful and hopeful that we can kind of create this community to keep talking amongst ourselves about how to kind of improve these practices and overcome challenges that you're seeing in your local county. Let's see here. My contact info is here, and I wanted to just take a second to also share our website. I want everyone, I'll put the link in the chat again, or I will ask one of my counterparts to do so. Karen, I see your hands raised. Let's go ahead and take a question from you.
Sorry, Ryan.
No, you're good.
Just as you were talking about the technical assistance, one of the pieces that has been helpful for Santa Barbara County, and we've reached out and collaborated with Mike on, is how best to set up sort of quick estimates of the impacts of coming legislation. So for like AB 1950, when that was coming down, we were really trying to understand the impacts that it would have on our staff and on our caseloads locally. And so Mike was really instrumental in helping us sort of kind of do that here locally so that we could make some resource shifts. But I think that would be something that would be possibly helpful as we talk about different technical assistance opportunities.
Absolutely. I have written that down, and I will, I'll reach back out to both you and Mike and kind of make sure that we're understanding where you guys came from. But I think the concept is absolutely on point. That is such a huge piece of things that are happening constantly, and one of the fires that continues to come up throughout the year. And so I think if we can help kind of tailor that to keep you focused on doing important operational work and not always having to spend every waking moment trying to figure out what the next policy impact will be, that would be helpful for everybody, I'm sure. Okay, any others before we move on? Okay, I don't see any hands raised, but always feel free to unmute yourself. So I wanted to show you the website. This website that we're building and will continue to build out is really aimed to put everything the CSAC Support Hub is doing right in one place for you. And so you can see here, we have some articles that we've released. We have some AB 372, which is domestic violence adjustments to batterers intervention programs, some of the work that's going on under that. And then really what you see here, the two pieces here is one is the results first database, kind of helps inform how you're building programming and aligning it to the evidence that exists out there. We've talked about that a couple of times, but I wanted to take you to this box here, the Framework Seminar Series. That is on our Support Hub website, and it contains everything that we've talked about in both seminar series. And so I'm going to put it in the chat too before we go. This is a great place to just keep it bookmarked. And anything that comes up around the strategic framework, anything that comes up around designing, implementing, data strategies, dashboards, evaluations, it's all in this one place. Sorry, I left that on my picture for a little bit too long. Hopefully everyone enjoyed that. So as you scroll down here, you get to see the Series 1 programming and all of the associated documents that go with it, including the recordings, the PowerPoint presentations. And as you keep scrolling down, you get to see the data and evaluation section. And you can see, as you're going through here, it really just is everything that we've talked about over the past 10 months. And there's even an opportunity if you want to leave a comment, you're missing something, you want to look at something. We want this to be user-friendly for you to ultimately kind of both be able to access, know that this stuff is here for everybody to access and really kind of dive into as you want. And then also just keep it as a resource. We're also here to help to do any of this stuff along with you. This is not meant to have you doing it on your own. We're here as a partner in all this work, but I think that the Support Hub website and this page in particular can be really helpful in kind of just keeping it bookmarked. Taking new staff and having them walk through these recordings, I think is something that's just beneficial for them to start thinking about how to start addressing and looking at programming. So lots of opportunity in here, and we'll keep building out this page as things come up that you really think are helpful, as we have future seminars that you think would be really productive to have that community collaboration amongst other counties. We'll keep working on it. So I just wanted to take that second. I can't see the chat exactly, but let's make sure that
I put them both in the chat, Ryan.
Thank you, Mia. Okay, I don't have anything else today. This ends our seminar series, but I will definitely, all the teams will be reaching out to the individual counties that are already partnered with. And then we'll also be holding some additional, I hope more seminar-like Zoom meetings in the future, either virtual or in person potentially, that really kind of help that community collaboration and really kind of focus on topics that might be of interest to you. So if you think of anything, feel free to send them over to me. I wanted to take this last minute and just thank you for joining us throughout these series. You all have been incredible, and this is a ton of work, a ton of information, but I think that it is so important and so critical to kind of continue moving the ball forward in local counties and the state. You all are informing policy all over the place, and I just can't thank you enough for joining us today and throughout this series. And just want to thank you again. We are all available to you anytime.